We're back again. This is part two of the coming of the Texas Revolution. This is actually a discussion on fighting the revolution and the aspects of it. The fact of the matter is when we go through this, I would, as I said in the first video that I cut, I would encourage you highly to make a point and go to the Handbook of Texas Online and read about the Texas Revolution. Truth be told, I won't go into as much detail about the Alamo and Goliad and San Jacinto as I normally would, just simply because I don't have time and I don't want to cut a video that's an hour and a half long. But I do want to touch on a few of those things. But I would suggest for the Alamo, there's a chapter in your reader, the Lone Star Reader, Determined Valor and Desperate Courage. That's a good article on the Alamo. The Goliad Campaign of 1836 and a companion biography on General Fannin would also be a good, or excuse me, Colonel Fannin, James W. Fannin, would be a good choice out of the Handbook of Texas Online. Here is what I'd tell you: use the Handbook of Texas Online. Don't use Wikipedia. I think the Handbook of Texas is vetted and superior to Wikipedia in this case. As far as San Jacinto is concerned, that would also be fair to read about. And last but not least, the Treaty of Velasco. Those are all important things. Probably even the Siege of Behar would be appropriate as well when it goes through it. Perhaps a Henry Wax Carnes would be a name you need to look up. Another name would be Erastus Def, or Def as it's actually spelled, Smith, Erastus Def Smith. And there are going to be numerous names and people and what have you in this Texas Revolution. Martin Perfecto de Cos, look for him as you read and just kind of keep an eye on what he's up to. Another name is Jose Urrea, Urrea. Read a little biography on him. So those are some major characters in the coming of the Texas Revolution and in the Texas Revolution that you ought to be well aware of. And politically, you might look at T.J. Rusk, Thomas Jefferson Rusk. The city and town is named after him. In addition to that, you might also look up David G. Burnett would be another one to look as well. So those are some options for you, just to go ahead and give you a little bit of a prep work and a few comments before we get going in this lecture today. So after the dramatic opening of the letters and the courier pouched by Bowie, it sobered most Anglos up and pretty much most Tejanos up as to you're going to have to make some choices now. As I said at the very closing of the last lecture, oftentimes you'll see people who want to try to sit the fence. Well, I'll get with the winner, whoever the winner is. And sometimes you can do that in revolutionary or political situations. But unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know which would be appropriate here. There may not be just a judgment call you can say one way or the other. But sometimes in life you have to make a choice to go one way or the other. It may be the right choice, it may not be, and as only as God can help you, you have to make that choice. So some Tejanos, maybe, in fact, a lot of Tejanos are going to say effectively, we're staying with Mexico because that's who our kinsmen are, that's who our culture is, that's who our government is. Whereas many of the Anglos who are either very new to the story of Texas, new to the place called Texas, or even those who are a little bit longer in the tooth from the 1820s, eventually will cast their lot looking eastward toward the United States. And those Anglos, some of them had become very pessimistic with the ongoing fiasco that was Mexican politics, and they had given up on the whole subject. So there are some options for you there to look at and to think about and to consider. But when the Mexican Army, Mexican government makes the decision to go ahead and try to bring Texas to heel in the mid 1835. In fact, actually, the early fall of 1835, there is going to be one of the flashpoints, and that's at Gonzales. And so the flashpoint of Gonzales is actually predated by another potential flashpoint down at the city of Victoria at this time period, literally called, I sometimes mispronounce it, just call it Victoria, named after Guadalupe Victoria. But oftentimes you'll see the city of Victoria referred to in the 1830s as Guadalupe Victoria, the whole name. But at the city of Victoria, there was a cannon there. And the Mexican government had asked for and demanded the recall of all cannon in Texas, especially cannon that had been given out by the Mexican government to protect against Indian attacks. And the the difference between, and this is kind of one of those cultural things, maybe even political too, one of the differences between the Mexican government and the American government, or said more correctly, the Tejanos and their Anglo neighbors, is that the Anglos believe that the cannon is theirs is for protection and they cannot be given up. Whereas the Tejanos, when given that order, if frankly in Mexico's system, a lawful order sorry for kicking the desk, but a lawful order to recall the cannon and send it back to San Antonio de Bejar, the Tejanos of Guadalupe, Victoria, the Tejanos of Victoria, Texas, are glad to, and I say glad, but they're willing to. That's probably better. They're willing to give up that cannon and send it back under a lawful order of Mexico's government. But up the road, up the Guadalupe River from Victoria, is the city of Gonzales, Texas. And at Gonzales, Texas, is a little old cannon. And this thing is about, no one would ever accuse it of being a bazooka. No one would ever accuse it of being a howitzer or some sort of large tube that you could reduce walls with. In fact, when you look at the cannon, it is really kind of small, and it's like a half-pound cannon. It's more of a flash bang operation designed to scare off Indians and Comanches and protect the settlers a little bit at least. The reality is that though the cannon has no real military impact on the war or anything like that, it becomes a symbol, and that really is, in a sense, the most important thing. Sometimes real things say guns matter. Say you've got a superior gun, and excuse me, I gotta take a drink. I've been lecturing all morning, and so you've been fighting with better weaponry. That does matter. Sometimes those sorts of things do matter. But sometimes in the scheme of politics and history, in the advance of military affairs, or things that, say, as Napoleon once said, a dog fight can bring on a battle, sometimes things are symbols and things matter. In World War I, a symbol would be, for the French, it would be Verdun. Or another symbol would be Paris. We've got to protect Paris. We've got to protect the great fortification at Verdun. And we must do all to protect it. And for, the Confederates in the Civil War, their symbol over time became Richmond. We must protect Richmond. We shall protect Richmond. And you spend blood and treasure on it. And for the Texians, especially Anglo-Texians around Gonzales, that little cannon, though effectively unimportant in the military scheme of things, is a great and good symbol for them that this is where the line of attack, the line of confiscation, the line of aggression by the Mexican government must be stopped. And yes, by Mexican rule and Mexican law, it is a lawful order to take that cannon. The Anglos said you cannot have it. And so there comes that flag that many of you are familiar with. It hangs in our classroom. It's called a come and take it flag. And when the Mexicans try to take that cannon, it's really nothing more than a minor skirmish. No Americans or Anglos are really hurt. There are very few Mexicans that are hurt or wounded in this thing. It's kind of a anticlimactic event. But what it does is it serves to rally the Texians, especially the Anglos, to the flag, to the cause, to the repelling of Santana and his dictatorial, tyrannical forces. And so the Texians are going to start marshaling together, and they're going to put together an army. And please listen to me as we go, because what I'm about to talk about here is going to dominate the majority of this lecture. It's not going to be a discussion about the Alamo. It's not going to be a discussion about Goliad. And that's why I say you need to read up on that. And it's not going to be San Jacinto. You need to read up in your textbook on the Handbook of Texas Online. Go there. But in this part here, I want to point out to you, and I want to talk about the two armies especially. This first army is the Texian Army, and that Texian Army is called the Army of the People. In the aftermath, the immediate aftermath in October of 1835 of this foray at Gonzales, hundreds of Texians come from all around the Midwest, the middle part of the state, or from central Texas, from East Texas, from along Brazoria at the coast. And many Texians will come and flock to Gonzales, forming an impromptu army where the next question is, what do we do? Do we stop here, or do we try to drive the Mexicans out and assert our rights here in December? Even as October 35, some would say we need to talk about independence, but many more would say we need to talk about asserting our rights as Mexicans and freeborn men. Mexican citizens, not so much the ethnicity part, but we need to assert our rights to protect the state from the onrushing, encroaching Mexican government in Mexico City. This is what we must do. We must drive the Mexican army out and protect Texas and declare ourselves independent from Coahuila. So there will be an independent Texas in the Mexican Federal Union, not Coahuila y Texas anymore. Others, of course, are talking independence total, but that's still a little bit in the future. So this army of the people come together. And one of the first things you've got to do when you build an army is you've got to put together a leadership team. You've got to have officers and generals and that sort of thing. When there's a spontaneous meeting of the people, Austin, who is a leader, thinks of himself as a leader, is a leader, acts as a leader, is trying to guide this as best he can. And quite honestly, though he is at times thought not radical enough, though he is a war man now, Austin is going to be the only person the various factions in Anglo and even Tejano, Texas, is going to agree to. The only person that they're going to allow, excuse me, I just heard something pop over here that I'm trying to figure out what that was, but he's the only person that that all these different factions within this army can agree to. So your general in the Army of the People initially is not Sam Houston, but Stephen F. Austin. He's a better lawyer than he is a general, but you got to deal with what you got to deal with. It is what it is. So when you talk about Austin as General Austin, next up you got to have some officers. He has a handful of men he puts on his staff, and one of those men is James Bowie. But here's the kicker. Here's the interesting factor in the whole matter, is that to be an officer in this army of the people, to be an officer, you had to be, write this down, elected. Today, that's unheard of. You would never have that. You would never have the U.S. Army saying, okay, let's have an election for colonel. Let's have an election for captain. And oh, by the way, you are a captain or a colonel or whatever your rank is, as long as the people want, as long as the soldiers want you. If they decide they want another officer, well, then you're out. There is no term of office. It's kind of a quixotic debating society. It's kind of a hairy-carry. It's really disorganized. And so these are, by the way, very proud and very independent-minded men. They are not pushovers, lackeys, or anything of that nature. So, quite honestly, when you talk about old Austin and his army, to be elected, what do? Do you promise them battle? Maybe so, but the bigger issue is what can you provide the men? Honestly, your campaign slogan, if there is such a thing in this army, and frankly it is if you vote for me, I will get you drunk. Because at times this army doesn't remind me of an army. It reminds me of a drunken drinking society. So the fact of the matter is that when you talk about the Texian Army, it drinks and it drinks and it drinks. In fact, actually, some of Austin's more dire letters as a general was this: for God's sakes, we need guns and we need clothing and we need food, but we don't need any more booze. Please stop the booze from coming to my army. They oftentimes were very drunk. So to the credit or discredit of the Texians, their army of the people is sometimes blitzed. In fact, it's seemingly always blitzed. Another man who's worth mentioning in this army is a fellow named Edward Burleson. Colonel Edward Burleson. Edward Burleson is a man's man. He is a man whom these rough-hewn frontier types, and many of them in this army come from that tradition, would attract themselves. In fact, Burleson will go all the way from a private to a general, back to a private, then to a colonel, and ultimately in Burleson's life, he's kind of a forgotten man in Texas history because of Houston and Lamar and others. But he was vice president of the Republic of Texas, a state senator, an Indian state senator, an Indian fighter, half a dozen other things, a surveyor. And if you drive through Bastrop on your way to South Austin or to San Antonio, you're going to come across Burleson Lane or Ed Burleson Lane, which is a nod to him because he lived out in that part of the world. And I'd invite you, if you have a chance, to stop to pause this lecture for just a moment and to pull up a picture of Ed Burleson, and you'll see Burleson, and he's got his head cocked off to the side about like I do, and he's got his eyes lit, and those eyes are burning. Evidently, the way the story goes is when he took that daguerreotype late in life, he took it over around San Marcos, where he was then living after the Revolution, after all said and done. This is in the early 1850s, if my memory is correct. And Burleson had a lot of miles on the body. He'd come from Tennessee. He had been at Horseshoe Bend with Jackson years before, so you get the picture. In fact, Burleson's father was at Horseshoe Bend and fought. Burleson's uncle had fought against Jackson's orders, and Burleson himself was about a 14-year-old kid who was also at the battle. So Burleson was there. But you can see in those eyes, and you can see in the rough-hewn character, the thing that would draw people to him. And he'll ultimately be a general at this army of the people. So you've got all that put together, and it is just an absolute menagerie of men. Some men who are in buckskin, others who are in top hats and dandy coats and broadcloth breeches, and you go all down the list, and drunk half the time. Many of them looking for fights, many of them looking for money, many of them looking for just anything to enjoy life. They're kind of a rough and rowdy crew. So this army starts to march toward San Antonio de Bexar, because that is the hub of Mexican military activity in Texas. If you want to stop the Mexicans, go to Bexar. Go to Bexar. Go to Bexar. And so the Texian Army, the Army of the People, which included names now like James Bowie, William Barrett Travis at times, James W. Fannin. In addition to that, Sam Houston will stop by for a moment, trying to convince the army to run away and leave. In fact, Houston was so unsuccessful in his complaints and his promises, this idea that you need to stop the fighting and go back to your homes. Houston was so unsuccessful, he went off and got uber drunk, and then proceeded to try to blow his own brains out, and James Bowie evidently had to sit on him all night long. It was not to Houston's credit. So in that sense, you might understand why people who dealt closely with Houston during this time didn't always respect him. They didn't always think highly of him. So Houston is in this thing, and then there are other worthy names as well. Juan Seguin, he's a leader of a Tejano faction in this army, and they are camped outside of San Antonio, first along the Cibolo Creek, just on the east side of the county, today's county, Bexar County, and then later over around today, if you're familiar with San Antonio, on the southeast side, there's a little place called the Little Red Barn. It's a restaurant, and about that territory right through there, the Texian Army camped again. And so this army is going to eventually march by October, early November on San Antonio de Bexar, and the army swells upwards of 900 men. In order to be in an army, folks, you have to have latrines. This army knew nothing of latrines, so people would use the restroom. They would go to the bathroom behind trees. That's a mess. In addition to that, they also had there was no uniform gun, no uniform clothing, no uniform anything. You brought the gun you had, whether it was a shotgun, whether it was a Kentucky long rifle, or whatever. And by the way, that's something I would put in your notes too, is that the main rifle used by these men is a Kentucky long rifle. The Kentucky long rifle is about 5 foot long, maybe a little shorter, depends on who exactly makes it. Throws about a 30 caliber lead ball. And by the way, all these lead balls that we're talking about in this time period are spherical. They're spherical. And so these lead balls, they're spherical, and the Kentucky long rifle with good gunpowder, and the Texians, of course, living on the frontier, sometimes have to hunt for their own food, maybe often have to hunt for their own food and shoot down things. They value good gunpowder. And so the Kentucky long rifle in the hands of a good marksman is effective out to 200 to 250 yards. It's a good gun for hunting and obviously for sniping as well. It has shortcomings when it comes to actual combat use because it's more delicate than the Mexican counterpart. You cannot affix a bayonet to it, which is essentially making it a pike. You cannot use it very well when you are on the back of a horse, because when you do that, you have to stop, get off at the horse, and reload the gun. Oh, by the way, to reload a Kentucky long rifle took somewhere in the neighborhood of at least 30 seconds. Maybe, depending on if you're nervous, jumpy, or whatever, it may be closer to 45 or 50 seconds. These are not repeating weapons. It is a much slower rate of fire than you get in the later 19th and early 20th century. But the Kentucky long rifle plus tomahawks, Bowie knives, Arkansas toothpicks, daggers, and your occasional brace of pistols, those are the weapons of the Texian Army and their various functions. The Texian Army at times is a coming and going, it's this and that, and one of the Austin's biggest problems is trying to hold them together and not let them run off on some sort of quixotic adventures and journeys. Sometimes you'll hear rumors, and this is worth noting too, especially you'll notice this when you read about the Goliad adventure, the Goliad events. When you get to reading about Goliad, one of the things that you'll hear the word is Matamoros. Matamoros is a siren to many Texians. Many Texians, especially down and around Fannon's territory, San Patricio even, they want to go to Matamoros because they think it has some money and you can draw it in. And it's really kind of it's kind of a shabbier idea in the Texas Revolution that the Texians sometimes chased after. But this army is proud. This army is independent, fiercely independent, ruggedly independent, and they pick up outside of Bexar a new recruit. Normally, you wouldn't spend any time talking about one man unless he's important, and of course, he is. And that man's name is Erastus Def, or Def to you and me, but Def is what they called him. Erastus Def Smith. Literally, he didn't hear very well. Def Smith is an Anglo by birth and by ethnicity, but in the early to mid 1825 actually, he moved to Bexar, and there while in Bexar he met a Tejana, a woman of Hispanic descent, and there they met, wed, and there they had kids. I think he had 3 or 4 or something like that. A good sized family, appropriate for the time period. And they set up a little old ranch south of town, probably somewhere around where Loop 410 on the south side is. But he's down on that part of the world, maybe closer to the San Antonio River than I give him credit for. But he had a warehouse, he had food, he was prosperous. He's not a wealthy man, even by the day's standards, but he was certainly not poor. And he was peaceable, and that's an important thing to understand here. Sometimes your actions will have longer consequences than you think. And in the hubbub of 1835, when San Antonio de Bexar was becoming more and more the Mexican military garrison, when Bexar was kind of the hub of military activity, you'll see these Mexican outfits that are sometimes manned by criminals. In fact, a lot of them are convict soldados. Others who are draftees really didn't want to be there. They don't make good soldiers. And some of them go out on patrols, and one of these patrols evidently stopped off and went to Def Smith's place. And they tried to clean out his warehouse, and I guess they effectively did. But Def Smith, the only thing he had that was against him was the fact that he was an Anglo. He had never taken up guns in support of the revolution. He had never countenanced revolution. He was not even a bomb thrower, figure of speech. He was never a agitator. He was quiet, peaceable, and by all accounts, simply a model Mexican citizen. He'd done nothing. He's married to a Tejana. He's got kids. I mean, you'd want a person like that in your country. Yet these soldados were so ravenous, so evidently so aggressive, and frankly so treacherous, perfidious, that they purloin his warehouse. And it makes Def Smith evaluate the situation. He says, basically, I can't support a government that will attack its peaceable citizens. I haven't done anything, and I won't be a party to that government anymore. Some men, it takes a while. You push and push and push, and finally they snap. Other men, you push once, especially if it's big enough, and that's it. You burn the bridge. And Def Smith was that way. The reason you mention Def Smith is because this Army of the People, Austin's army, later Houston will be commander of this army. is that the army of the people is going to be absolutely independent, but there are characters running around in there that make great scouts. Probably the greatest scout, or one of the great scouts at least, in this army is Erastus Def Smith. He spoke the Spanish language well. He spoke English well. He knew how to fit in. He knew how to infiltrate. He knew how to exfiltrate. I mean, my point is, this man was the quintessential scout for the era, and he was invaluable to Sam Houston in the long retreat out of Gonzales in 1836, all the way the retreat to San Jacinto. It ultimately happens there. So you talk about all that sort of stuff, and there's another scout that's going to be very important in this Bexar siege and activity, and that man's name is Henry Wax Carnes. Henry Wax Carnes. Carnes County is named for him. Carnes is a red-headed, about 25-year-old man. This man is born seemingly on the back of a horse. He's somebody, like so many of these early Texians are, he's more comfortable in the back of a horse or out on the range, say at Burleson would be this way too, than he would be playing house with a wife. Not to say he wasn't married. I think Carnes wasn't married, but you can check me on that. But he's just one of those frontier types, those rugged frontiersmen. And during the Battle of San Antonio de Bexar in December 1835, you can look the dates up yourself. But the long and the short of it is that the Texian Army had something called the Medal of Honor, or some sort of Croix de Guerre, the Cross of War, or the Iron Cross if it's German, or they had some sort of medal for valor, which they didn't. Wax Carnes, would have gotten one of them because he was that valorous of man. He's also a scout. He helps protect the rear guard of the army as it's falling back, and he and Smith are valuable intelligence gatherers for Sam Houston in the retreat of 1836. Stephen F. Austin and his war council, Burleson, Bowie, and a handful of other men, come to the conclusion in early November 1835 that there was absolutely no way that this army could attack and take. This army could attack and take the I guess you could say it like this: they couldn't take Bexar. The Alamo was too strong, in a sense. More especially, the city was too strong. Remember this: Bexar, the city of San Antonio de Bexar, was established partially with the defense and protection against Indian attacks in mind. So many of the Bejareños had built houses that were thick, kind of octagonal sorts of houses. What do you call those houses? Not bunk houses. They were kind of they're octagonal in nature, have firing ports, sally ports that you can shoot through with your rifle, with your musket if it's that. You can defend yourself very easily against marauding Indians. So the houses of San Antonio are really well built for defense. And the Mexicans there in San Antonio, the soldados, they may not be great soldiers, but they do have decent enough weapons, and they, when pressed, would probably fight. They may not throw their hands up right away. So the Texians come to the conclusion, we've got to hold out here. We've got to hold out and just starve them out. And so this army is not meant for starvation, in the sense that they're not meant for a siege, starving out your enemy. This army is put together, comes together for the purpose of fighting. So the army, somewhere around 900 men in November of 1835, starts to dwindle down 800, 700, 500, whatever, by the time you get to early December 1835. One of the more comic things that ever takes place in this whole siege, and by the way, if you think beef is good, and I like beef too, I actually like pork better. But truth be told is that a good steak is hard to beat. But this army ate beef all the time. One of the complaints these men had is that, can you please get us something other than beef? And by the way, this is not ribeye. This is grass-fed beef, and it is some tough stuff if you've ever had grass-fed beef. But these men wanted to fight, and rumors got going in the Texian army that there was a Mexican money train that was headed toward the Alamo, headed toward Bexar, that was going to pay the soldados. And the rumor just flew around. Austin heard of the rumor, and he said, this is not true, this cannot be true, and even if it is, it's nothing more than to try to get us to break the siege. Don't go. This army did not listen to its commander. has no discipline, breaks off and starts chasing after this money train. Well, they captured the money train. It was real. But what they found when they opened the bags of these erstwhile money trains, these mules that were supposed to be filled down with gold to pay the soldados, what they found in there was grass. Historically, we call it the grass fight. But what the Texians did not understand, at least some did not understand this, others did, is that the grass fight revealed how well that siege was working, that the mules and the oxen and other animals, pack animals, service animals, feed animals, food animals, they were starving in Bexar. So that was working. But by December 4th, 1835, the Texian Army was dwindling down, and now Stephen F. Austin's gone. Austin had been gone for several weeks. Edward Burleson had been elected to be general. And Burleson said, we have got to make a decision. Shall we attack or shall we not? And so Burleson wanted to attack. But Burleson's officers said, we can't do it. This army is too small. It's too weak. What are we going to do? Well, we need to go home. So Burleson agreed, and they decided to strike the tent, to go home. And out of the fog of history, out of the crowd, in a sense, he's known to people, certainly, but for us, I've never mentioned him yet until now. The man's name is Ben Milam. Ben Milam. Ben Milam was an older man, older in the sense that he's in his, I believe, late 40s, early 50s. And he had been around the block in Mexico and in Texas for some time. He was a bit of a filibusterer at heart. He was a bit of a schemer and a dreamer. And he is a man to be reckoned with. And evidently he was mad. He had heard that they were going to strike the tent and go. We're going to leave. And so Ben Milam goes out of his tent and he goes into Burleson's tent and he pulls the flap behind him. And evidently these two men yelled at each other for the next 45 minutes. And you know as well as I do that a canvas tent is not very thick. And people who are packing up, getting ready to go decided to stop. Let's see what happens. And after that discussion with General Burleson, Colonel Milam comes out of the tent and he raises the question. And it's a famous question in Texas history. Who will go with old Ben Milam into San Antonio? Who will go with old Ben Milam into San Antonio? And the answer comes back from the crowd, I will, I will. Few didn't, but most did. The next morning, bright and early, Burleson takes a smaller force of men around the circle and surround the Alamo. You must remember that the Alamo in 1835 is out of town. Today, it looks like it's just all in downtown because the city's grown up around it. But in 1835, the city of San Antonio de Bexar was effectively around Military Plaza. It was around San Fernando Cathedral, today the cathedral, then a church, and the Bexar County Courthouse. It's a little bit west. And then you had the river that you crossed, which was nothing like it is today, of course. And then you had the Alamo. The Alamo sat on the outskirts of town. And so the Alamo is kind of the hub of the military operations. And so Burleson and his men are listening to see if the Alamo is on alert, if they're worried about it, if they're expecting something to happen. You're looking for surprise. And so while Burleson's watching the Alamo, Milam and his strike force with Carnes and hundreds of other men are preparing to enter into San Antonio in the nighttime and pass through and try to drive the Mexicans out and annihilate them. Well, at about, I believe it was about 5 a.m., it may have been 4 a.m. on December 5th, a cannon shot from Burleson's cannon was the signal to go ahead because the Alamo was quiet and you wanted to pin those boys down. When that shot was heard, Milam and his men go after it. And they are going to attack San Antonio de Bexar. It takes 4 days, December 5th through December 9th. It takes them 4 days to do it, and some of that fighting is tenacious. I mean, it is some hand-to-hand combat stuff. In fact, Ben Milam doesn't survive the first day. He, Burleson, and a handful of other officers, I believe they were standing in Ursula Veramendi's, the Veramendi house courtyard, and somebody was sitting in a cypress tree along the banks of the river. banks of a creek even, and this Mexican sniper sitting in the tree drilled Milam in the face with a Smith, not Smith, with a Spence, not Spencer. It was a, oh gosh, it was a sniper rifle of the era. Leave it at that without me having to reach for some notes that are away from me right now. But anyways, Milam dies. He kind of becomes a hero there. Burleson and his men are going to eventually clear the town. And Martin Prefecto de Cos, the commander there at San Antonio de Bejar, is going to surrender his forces, and they head southward. The Texians thought that everything was fine. In some Texian minds, it was all over. The Mexicans will never come back. Other Texians said, nah, they won't come back right away. They'll come back here in April or May, and then we'll have to fight them again. And that's when the real battle will take place. Maybe June. We'll see. But we've got time. Let's party. Let's have a fiesta. And that was a mistake. As Cossa's men, who were paroled and sent southward, they hit the Rio Grande River. And when they hit the Rio Grande River, they come into contact with a much larger Mexican force. In fact, there were two Mexican forces entering into Texas, one going up the coast, and that's under General Urrea, who is a very good general, very able general. And then the main body, the main force is under Santana himself, coming into Texas. And he is crossing at Presidio del Rio Grande, and there Cosas turned around and said, "You will come with us." So when we talk about the Mexican army, this army is called, this is the Second Army. The Army of the People is the Texian Army. The Army of Operations is the Mexican Army. The Army of Operations is a bit of a close-run affair. In fact, actually, for me a little bit, though the Texian Army is an interesting army to study, no doubt about that. A debating society, they get drunk all the time. I mean, what can you go wrong with? But the Army of Operations, the Mexican Army, is a mess. Its leadership, as we've kind of talked about before, its leadership is not very good. Santana is a great organizer. He is a great putter. He can put an army together, come defend Mexico against the Anglos, come defend Mexico against the Norte Americanos, all those sorts of things. But the Mexican army's got bad officers. Some of them are just incompetent. Others are political goons. They don't make good soldiers, officers in that sense. So really one of the stories of Mexico's army during this time period is that these armies, plural, will be let down by, generally speaking, overall bad officers, or at least incompetent officers. The Mexican army itself is going to be made up of men who are, a lot of them are going to be just flat out recruits. They're going to be drug. Now, I say recruit makes it sound like you went down to a recruiting station and you got pulled in. I should say they're not recruits. They're really conscripts, meaning they're drafted into the army. Just imagine, if you would, you were there walking the streets in some town, say Guanajuato or Yucatan or Zacatecas even. And then all of a sudden, you see this army squad. It comes through and they say, "Boy, you look like you really wanted to join the Mexican army today. Congratulations, you have just joined the Mexican army," and they suck you in and you're going to Texas. In some cases also, the Mexican recruiters were not terribly picky about your background. We've already established the fact that there were convicts who were in the army. There were convicts in the Mexican army here coming to Texas. So you've got a motley crew of varying degree of soldier in the infantry. The next thing to keep in mind, too, is that you do have really good cavalry. Let's be careful about that. You have really good cavalry. And the cavalry, by the way, the infantry are the foot soldiers, the artillery, the guys with the cannons. The artillery is okay. They have enough to do some damage, but Santana could have done a lot better than he did. So next thing I would tell you, too, is that the cavalry's job in this army, it's true for other armies, but this army particularly, the cavalry's job is to ring a battlefield. Obviously get intel and do reconnaissance work out on the field, but at the Alamo, the cavalry is there to ring the battlefield. Should any Texian try to escape out of the Alamo, you run them down and spear them. If any recruits try to run away in the middle of the battle, you run them down and spear them too. The cavalry is there as kind of to hold everything together and not let anybody go. And that was pretty good. They were pretty well led. You'll also have some, I believe they're called Zapadores, but these fellas who are really, you can almost call them axemen, giant men with impressive clothing, and they're going to hack their way through some of the Alamo's wooden doors and facades and so forth. So this army is being put together. By the way, this army, as far as food is concerned, nearly starves to death. Their diet is very limited and very traditional. In fact, sometimes in northern Mexico, they almost run out of food. The second thing is that in northern Mexico, they run out of water about 50 miles away from the Rio Grande River before they could get any water. And, oh, by the way, the Mexican army also didn't have good wagons. When you talk about wagoners, those men who drive wagons, they're called Teamsters. Teamsters. Today it's a truck driving union, but it's the same idea. The Teamsters of Mexico did not like the Mexican government because the Mexican government had beat them out of money before. You would think that the Mexican government would treat them better, but they hadn't. The Mexican government treated them quite poorly, and in fact, at the outbreak of the Texas Revolution, the Teamsters of Mexico basically said to the government, if you want us to work for you, you got to pay us up front a portion of what you owe us, and your rate is very high. And if we get any inclination or any word that you aren't paying what you're owing and not paying on time, we're out of here. In fact, outside of the Rio Grande, about that 50, 80 miles territory, maybe 100 miles outside of the Rio Grande on the south side of the river, the Teamsters up and quit. They walked off the job. So now you've got these poor infantrymen, these poor privates who have no idea how to drive a mule. Some cases, and there is an art to it. It's not just beat the mule to death. You can't do that. And so these guys are trying to drive mules, and it's all a fiasco of logistics. The army is going to have people fall out. People will almost starve to death in the mountains of Mexico. They'll almost freeze to death in the mountains of Mexico. Yes, that is true. This was one of the worst winters in all of Mexican history as far as going through the mountains, marching through it. And last but not least, the soldados will have with them what are called soldaderas, just soldaderas. And what it is, a soldadera is a woman who is following the army. It is tradition in Mexico and it's tradition in Spain that there will be women followers in the army. Some of them for more earthy pleasures, if you like. More often than not, the soldaderas act as cooks, act as cleaning agents, they act as nurses and doctors, and they follow the army. Basically half a dozen, let's see, it could be your mother, it could be your sister, it could be a daughter, it could be a wife, or all the above. And they are eating you out of house and home. And I've posed this question to students over the years. Why didn't the Santana regime tell those women, look, we have no food, we don't have much water, you're eating all our food and drinking our water, and we're going to starve to death, we're never going to get to Texas? Why didn't they say, go home, you can't come? And the answer is this. The general understood and received wisdom was the Mexican army would disintegrate if the soldaderas went home, because most of the men would follow the women home. The Mexican army didn't have good leadership. It had poor logistics, and right this next and last point down, I believe would be the last point. They also, well, in fact, let me just say this before I get to this last point. Most of the Mexican soldados, had they had good medical care, would have survived the Alamo. In fact, though, about 700 will die at the Alamo because they had such poor medical care, even for the time period. By the way, so the last point here is money. The Mexican government has no money. We've talked about that in this class already. If the Mexican government has no money, and it doesn't, where are they going to get the money to pay the soldados, the soldaderas, if that's appropriate? Probably wouldn't be. Where are they going to pay the Teamsters? The answer, the Catholic Church. And this is not the first time the government of Mexico has gone to the Catholic Church and gotten a major loan for military operations or some other operations. And trust me, the loan rates were very high because the Catholic Church had been squeezed out of money by the government before. So it is a shoestring operation of the first order. The last thing I want to say to you is this: is that the weapons that the infantrymen used, bought by the government a year or two before, was the India pattern Brown Bess musket. The India pattern Brown Bess musket. It is a wonderful weapon for the time period. It is made of a walnut stock. Walnut is a very hard wood and a very hard to break wood, so you can use that walnut stock as a club and swing it. That Brown Bess also has a pike on the end of it, or say it differently, a bayonet, and you can stab with the bayonet, so that makes it effective in that manner. The Brown Bess musket is inaccurate. It's only accurate out to about 50 to 60 yards, especially if you got bad gunpowder. But if you have good enough gunpowder, and you can get that bullet out the end of the gun, and some men didn't get the bullet out the end of the gun, the fact of the matter is the bullet is going to be thrown as a 75 caliber bullet. 75 caliber is 3/4 of an inch. That big old spherical ball is going to go whoop into you and whop you in the head. It's going to hurt a whole lot. It's going to hurt a whole lot. It's going to kill you. It was really a good weapon. And the Mexicans had good weapons in that sense. They had good weapons all the way through. The problem is that bad gunpowder, which we've established. And the second thing, in order to make this Brown Bess go, you had to execute about 20 different movements. I think it's 22 actually, but you had to execute 22 separate movements in the middle of a battlefield. When you haven't had much training, you're nervous, you're jumpy, you're scared. Just imagine if you had just been standing in line, and by the way, the soldados, or the green recruits, are going to be basically smashed into the middle, in the middle of the Mexican lines assaulting the Alamo in 1836. The green recruits are jammed in nice and tight, because if you didn't do that, they might run away. On the edge are the sergeants who have cudgels or clubs, essentially, and those sergeants have the right. If you see a soldado trying to flee, you have that right to take that club and club them in the head with it and knock them out or kill them. It didn't matter. So there you are, jammed in nice and tight. And you have just seen a cannonball bounce from the Alamo, or perhaps shrapnel if it's more appropriate there. When they get in close, that's certainly what they're going to catch. You get some shrapnel fired out of a cannonball, and that thing is just taking out your buddy, and you just now have his brain matter scattered all over you. You'd want to run, but you can't because of what I just told you. Now you got to execute and fire your weapon at a proper in a proper order, and you haven't had trained that much. The fog of war, the confusion of battle, and the emotions and the blood that is up, you will see, men, this is not just true about Mexico, but say the British Army and other armies as well that use the Brown Bess. They would forget a step, or they would forget to pull the ramrod out the end of their muzzle, cock the hammer back, snap, bang, off it goes, and the ramrod goes out in the middle of the pasture, out in the middle of the battlefield. You got a stick in your hands now. Or you didn't hear the gun go off because it was so crazy on the battlefield. What do? Oh my gosh, what are we up to? Well, let's see here. We may have 2, 3, 8, 10 bullets in the barrel before the battle's over. It was a complete pandemonium. So you had to train, and unfortunately for the soldados, a lot of them were not trained, and some of them only came into battle with about 4 bullets. So that's a good place to stop right there. I would ask you to, like I said, to read up on the Battle of San Jacinto, the Battle of Goliad. The Coleto Creek is the battle, but the campaign of 1836, Battle of the Alamo, read the details on that. That Texas handbook stuff won't take you more than about 20 to 30 minutes to do. Good stuff, good material. And, I guess you could say it like this, to see if you watch this thing all the way through to the very end. And you could bring this with the sheet that you started with the end of the last lecture. You bring me a sheet on Thursday with what I told you from the first lecture about the coming of the Texas Revolution. You add those dates on there, and then now you add on this part as well. What did the Texians say at San Jacinto as they attacked the Mexican breastworks? What were the words they said? And then there was one Texian who also said something special. But if you can get that last part, I'll be really impressed. But really just give me, what did the Texians say as they attacked the Mexicans at San Jacinto? Anyways, that'll take care of this. Read up, and we'll see you either for the optional or for the final exam. Thank you.